What makes you so sure China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, and I read every day, I mean, why would China want a threat? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer. Get this right, Laura. This is about the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in Asia. Now, this is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no part of it. There's no Alaska, there's no islands, there's no US in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometres across the Pacific to the coast of California. So they are not a metropolitan Asian power, but they claim to be and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. They're looking around for suckers, global Britain. And they found, here's a bunch of accommodating people in Australia. At the Kabuki show in San Diego a day or so ago, there's 3 leaders standing there. Only one is paying. Our bloke, Albo.
And secondly, you have a tremendous skill for invective and criticism. Could I ask you now to turn some of that to the Chinese Communist Party and its treatment of Uyghurs, for example, its treatment of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong? Will you be similarly critical of them as you are of people in your own party and journalists?
After what you co-wrote with Harcher last week in that shocking presentation in the Herald on Monday, Tuesday, and when you should hang your head in shame, I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism, I mean, that's the most egregious, the worst, the most biased presentation. And here you are asking me about Uyghurs, and you're asking me about, if I said to you, and I did say when I saw it last time, here's the Prime Minister over, there's everyone over to India, not one question from any one of you about Modi shutting in the Muslims in Kashmir, in the pro-Hindu policies. Nothing.
But there is still a question, Mr Keating, about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, well, look, the treatment of the Uyghurs, I'm not to defend China about the Uyghurs. I mean, there's disputes about what the nature of the Chinese affront to the Uyghurs are. There's a dispute about that. But one thing we can't be sure of, what if the Chinese said, but look, what about deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in your prison system? Wouldn't that be a valid point for them?
What you just saw were clips from a fiery exchange at Australia's National Press Club on March 15th, 2023. The man at the centre of it, former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating, facing a room full of the country's most powerful media journalists. It should have been a serious debate about the nation's future. At the time, the Australian government had just made a historic decision, a nuclear submarine deal with the US and the UK, tying Australia's destiny to the United States more deeply than ever before. However, the very journalists who should have been representing the Australian people, asking tough questions about this massively expensive pact, seemed to be working from a different script, one that served America's strategic agenda almost entirely. Their goal was to take down Keating, the elder statesman who dared to question the US-Australia alliance. They thought it would be an easy kill. They were dead wrong. In the content that follows, you will witness a rare public humiliation. This is not a debate. It is a masterclass in what bad journalism looks like. You will see how one veteran statesman, all by himself, systematically dismantled the bias, ignorance, and hypocrisy of an entire media elite, using nothing more than basic facts and logic. It exposed a deep crisis facing not just Australia, but many Western nations. When the media stopped serving the interests of its own country, who is left to defend them? Let's continue.
The idea that we need American submarines to protect us, 3, if we buy 8, 3 are at sea, 3 are going to protect us from the might of China, really. I mean, the rubbish of it, the rubbish. So in other words, let me say this. China has not threatened us, and despite 5 years of this China threat appearing in the Sydney Morning Herald, particularly, written by, provocateurs like Harcher and people, it's all been untrue.
So
it's untrue.
So if the threat isn't about direct invasion, as you say, there is still an issue about China finding its place in the region and being more assertive in the region.
Yeah.
What's the appropriate strategic response to that?
Yeah. Well, I say in the speech, but it's worth saying here. China has committed, in the eyes of the United States, the great sin of internationalism. And what is that sin? To develop an economy as big as the United States. That's the sin. They've got as big as the US. You see, and all those strategic people in the US, they get their little book out and they say, oh, state as big as us. They're licking through trying to find that, and they can't find it. You see, the Americans will never condone or accept a state as large as them, and that's what China presents. China's mere presence. I mean, they would have preferred they remain in poverty, 20% of humanity forever. But the fact that China is now, an industrial economy larger than the United States, larger, according to the IMF, 20% larger, they say, hang on, this is not in the playbook. This is not in the playbook. What an affront. So this is what this is about. It's about the maintenance of US, get this right, Laura, this is about the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in Asia. Now, this is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no part of it. There's no Alaska, there's no islands, there's no US in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometres across the Pacific to the coast of California. So they are not a metropolitan Asian power, but they claim to be and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. So what are the Chinese supposed to say to that? Oh, that's okay. We've been here 4,000 years. We've developed, we've been subjugated by every bugger known to man. We've developed a decent economy, a decent standard of living, shelter, accommodation, education, that's our sin, is it? That's our sin. And we've got to be superintended by your Navy, by the US Navy.
So you would always argue that we have to find our security in Asia.
Exactly.
And you would also argue that we have to maintain our own sovereignty in our policy.
Yeah.
If those are the rules, but you do have a China challenging the orthodoxy, if you like, of the region.
But the thing is, it's not challenging.
I'm not saying they're talking about threatening, to invade anybody, but they are a rising power and they are getting more assertive in their
Well, they're not stupid.
What
would you do if you had an economy 20% bigger than the US? Would you hide your light under a bushel?
What should we do? What do you think is the appropriate response? For example, if the Chinese want to assert themselves in terms of rights against the Philippines or Vietnam, we're not talking about an invasion or war, but in terms of asserting their rights, what is the defence and strategic?
What do you think the United States in the Western Hemisphere doesn't assert its rights against Cuba?
They're another superpower.
No, I'm just saying.
That's reasonable enough if you say that's what the US does, and you can say, well, that's what China does because it's a superpower. But what does it mean for us? What should we be doing? What
it means for us is prosperity. That's what it means for us. It means that we join with 20% of humanity as they've dug themselves from poverty. So you've got to remember this about China. We're speaking of it as though it's almost like the old Soviet Union. It is not the Soviet Union. It's in the IMF. It's in the World Bank. It's in the WTO. It's in the WHO. You had Xi Jinping at Davos 5 years ago proselytising in favour of globalisation. I mean, this is not a state which wishes to overturn the West. But there's a whole lot of difference in not wishing to overturn the West and copying the nonsense from the Americans that the Chinese should live forever under their strategic command. You follow me?
You've also said, though, in this speech that as a result of this announcement, in part, that the Chinese, we have set the clock ticking almost. That it has set a new trajectory for relationships in the region.
Yeah, look, China is a lonely state. That's the truth of it. They would fall over themselves having a proper relationship with us. Fall over themselves. We supply their iron ore, which keeps their really industrial base going, and there's nowhere else but us to get it. We're providing them wheat, we provide them all sorts of things, investment, what have you. They are 12 flying hours from us. We have a continent of our own, a border with no one, no border disputes with them. Perfect. No, we've manufactured a problem. You know, don't let the sleeping dogs lie. You know, we've given the old dog a kicking, you know. And so instead of saying, you see, one of the points I've made here, and what's one of the principal problems of this deal is that defence has overtaken foreign policy. I mean, you don't see Penny Wong out there, you see Miles out there. You know, standing on the submarines is Miles, it's not Penny Wong. So what's happened is that the military have taken over the foreign policy. And as a consequence, we're not using diplomacy. I mean, let me just make this point. Running around the Pacific Islands with a lei around your neck handing out money, which is what Penny does, is not foreign policy. It's a consular task, fundamentally. Foreign policy is what you do with the great powers, what you do with China, what you do with the United States. This government, the Albanese government, does not employ foreign policy, right?
But it has improved the relationship with China since it's come to office?
Look, they've decided not to speak rudely or loudly, but at core you can see what the outcome is. Here's Anthony Albanese signing up with the Americans, the British. I mean, look, let's remember about the British. They pulled their Grand Fleet out of East Asia in 1904. They witnessed the capitulation of Singapore in 1942, right? They then announced their East of Suez policy in 1968. In other words, you're all on your own, you Australians. We're leaving. We'll leave you with Singapore and New Zealand and Malaysia, right? The FPDA, you know. And then in 1973, just to make sure we got the message, they said, well, buggy you, we're going into Europe, so no wheat, no wool, no, you know. And then, of course, after the great problem of Brexit, after that fool Johnson destroyed their place in Europe, 2 world wars. It took 2 world wars to drag Britain to the centre of Europe, to sit beside Germany as the second major power. No, you know, the empirical people, you know, the Tories, that's good enough for us. We're Great Britain. We're the great power. So, OK, they're now out of, so then they're going to put together global Britain. So they're looking around for suckers, you know, global Britain. And they found, ooh, here's a bunch of accommodating people in Australia, you know, an accommodating Prime Minister, you know, a conservative Defence Minister, a risk-averse Foreign Minister. Let's put a proposition to them. So here we are, 230 years after we left Britain, we are returning to the Cornwall, where Morrison did this deal. We're returning to Cornwall, and now Rishi Sunak, for God's sake, for Australia to find our security in Asia. I mean, how deeply pathetic is that?
Well, when we last spoke in 2021, the Morrison government had just announced the AUKUS deal. You're savagely critical, as we've seen, of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister in this deal. What does it represent in the sense of our strategic and defence position?
What does it represent?
That's been announced.
Look, I'd say for the cost, $360 billion. For $360 billion, we're going to get 8 submarines. Right? It must be the worst deal in all history. But let's say 360. If we were buying Collins-class replacements, we'd get at least 40 to 50 of those submarines. 40 to 50 for the same price. Now, no Navy's ever done better than having 1/3 of their boats at sea at any one time. So we would have, let's call it 45 to make it simple, you know, or something like that. We'd have, you know, a third of them, 15, say, at sea. 15 at sea, against 3 nuclear boats. 15 against 3. Now remember, the nuclear boat's only firing a traditional torpedo. It's not firing a nuclear torpedo, just like the other boats. And because it's 8,000 tonnes, that's big, they'll be discoverable from space. And what's more, they are too big for the shallow waters of the Australian coast. A 4,000 tonne boat, like the Collins, worked perfectly around the Australian coast because it was designed to protect Australia. It wasn't designed to sit off the Chinese coast sinking Chinese submarines, right? So now we've got a big 8,000-tonne clunker. We get 3 instead of 15. And you know what the Navy says? I saw with Miles, I saw Vice Admiral Collins, the head of the Navy, recently. They came up to see me. And Collins said, you know, well, Mr Keating, he said, you know, we've got to put the snort up every night to get the oxygen. I said, Admiral, please don't think I'm stupid. You only need to put the snort up if you're going at full power. If you go just cruising, you put the snort up every 4 days or so. And it may be that it is more risky now than it was 30 years ago. But if you've got 15 of the things at sea, how in the God would knocking one out matter? But if you knock one of the 3 nuclear subs out, it really matters. So now, they don't snort, but they'll be found because of their bulk. Yeah.
So in terms of the actual deal, though, you've basically said that it's been structured to support US industry by buying into the Virginia-class submarines in the short term, and that the deal is driven by the fact that the Americans don't want to disrupt or can't disrupt their manufacturing capacity, and thus there's this proposal for the British to sort of co-build the
That's right. Well, look, at the Kabuki show in San Diego a day or so ago, there's 3 leaders standing there. Only one is paying. Our bloke, Albo. The other 2, you know, they've got the band playing. Happy days, I hear again. You know, the American president can hardly put 3 coherent sentences together. You know, he was happy about it all. Rishi couldn't believe, you know, Rishi, you know. And so guess what? We're going to pass across $380 billion, dollars over time to British Aircraft BAE Systems, a British company, to build these things, and to the American submarine things, submarine companies, and we have to build the bases here. So, you know, at San Diego there was only one payer, the Australian Prime Minister. You know. So
where does it leave us then if we are so entrenched?
The answer is in deep doo-doo. That's where it leaves us.
Where does it go?
Where does it go? I think. I mean, what'll happen is we'll get sucked into the American control system. We'll start to. You've got to remember, it was Julia Gillard and Stephen Smith in the Obama visit who first allowed basing in Australia. I would never have allowed American basing in Australia, but they allowed it. You know, so now we're going to have Americans submarines coming and going, and of course they would say, oh well, of course these are on rotation; they're not permanent. But if the rotation is permanent, they are permanent.
Does it make a material difference, though, that rotational presence? You know, in the way China sees it?
It just means that we are in the ambit of the US Strategic Command System. That essentially we've turned the place out. You know, in other words, we don't run the place ourselves anymore.
It essentially adds to the sense that we are our own. When we get our own Virginia-class submarines, for example, we basically are an adjunct to the Americans. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course. The reactor is run by the Americans. The control system is run by the Americans, and of course, Anthony Albanese is running around now. Every second sentence he talks about. What's the word?
Sovereignty?
Sovereignty? Sovereignty, yeah. He thinks if he drops the word into enough sentences in an hour, it'll actually happen. Our sovereignty is just being peeled away by all this, you know. I mean, with the Collins-class boats, we had complete sovereignty. And I'll tell you something else, which I don't think the media knows, but I know. The French government have offered the Australian government a new deal on the submarines, and that would be the new French nuclear submarine, the newest one in the world, 5% only enriched uranium, not 95% weapons grade, delivery firm date 2034, fixed prices. No response have the French had to that. Instead of that, we're going to be running around, and I mean the ignominy of having the British around. Here they are, you know, Thatcher wiped out their manufacturing sector when she knocked the unions over. They're on the bones of their bum, searching the world for, the new Britain, and here we are in Asia going back to Britain, after they've dumped us, completely dumped us all through the 20th century.
You were just talking about the low-enriched uranium submarines from France. I mean, one of the things that we weren't expecting out of yesterday's announcement, which we did get, was the revelation that we're going to hold on to the uranium and have to find a storage for it after the submarines, hypothetical submarines, reach the end of their life. Yeah. What's your take on that, in particular, what its imputation is for non-proliferation? Well,
I don't think burying spent fuel rods is proliferation, and Australia is big enough for that. It's a minor issue. Look, the bigger issue is this. I'll read this to you. Every year, the United States Department of Defence has a statutory responsibility to report to the Congress. And in November of 2022, in its report, the Defence Department said this: the People's Republic of China aims to restrict the United States from having a presence in China's periphery. In other words, not having our ships run up and down their coast. That's what it really means. Any more than the Americans would consider. Like, just imagine, could you just imagine if the Chinese Blue Water Navy decided to do their sightseeing 6 miles off the coast of California? Could you imagine the brouhaha that would go on? So here's the Department of Defence, not me, or those of us that have air view. The PRC aims to restrict the United States from having a presence in China's periphery. In other words, China wants to have, as a great state, they want their front doorway clean, just as if you take the Western Hemisphere, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, there's no way the Americans would want anyone else in that area. And this thing goes on to say, the PLA is increasingly able to project its power into the Philippine Sea. Well, you could just about swim across the Philippine Sea. I mean, shocking. Here's the Chinese, but this is the Americans themselves. So here we are, there's the Australian government where, we're going to stop those Chinese, we're going to poke their eyes out, we're going to get these subs. But the US Defence Department says, oh, by the way, I think the Chinese are really only interested in their front door, their periphery, I mean, that takes all the speculation out of it, doesn't it? And just make this point about the United States, threats to the United States. China does not threaten the United States. Nobody can threaten the United States. It's got 10,000 kilometres of sea between the Chinese coast and California. It's got the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. It has a massive country with in space, land mass and friends in Canada on the north and Mexico on the south, and the greatest armaments in all history. So there's no way the Chinese would ever think of attacking the United States and have never thought to attack the United States. So here we're in this position. The Chinese cannot attack the United States and have never thought so, and cannot attack Australia and have never thought so. Because if they try to attack Australia, we'd simply sink the armada of the combat ships, of the troop ships coming. So all of this is all foreign policy spook-like talk. These spook agencies all have a dirty postcard up their sleeve. When I was Prime Minister, people say, "Oh, you're not at all interested in the cables." The product of the security agencies. And they'd have some PM. We've been listening to someone's phone, and they've just said this. I said, listen, if I want to find out about Malaysia and Singapore, I'll read the Straits Times. I'll get more out of that than your nonsense.
The language yesterday was all about this being a deterrence at some level. That it's sending a signal to China that we're not.
In other words, we're not going to. You may attack us when we know they're not going to attack us and have never threatened to attack us and don't wish to attack us. That's the point. You see, don't underestimate the effect that the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age for 5 years. I've been attacked by Harcher, that psychopath who runs this attack on me about me being a representative or putting the views of the People's Republic of China, But he's had free movement for 5 years to run this scare campaign in Australia and this was supported by the management of Nine Group. This fellow, James Chessel, I understand, sits at the top. So Chessel is part of the responsibility here, you know. And so this maniac has put this stuff, and he's on the ABC, he's on the drum every other night, you know. He's got the great stentorian voice, but no stentorian mind to match it.
The suggestion always is that your commercial interests drive what you say about China.
Let me make this. Let me deal with this. They talk about me on China Development Bank. I was on China Development. By the way, I left 5 years ago. Right, I was on the China Development Bank board for 13 years and 10 years as chairman. Right, with Henry Kissinger, with Paul Volcker, with the former managing director of the IMF, Jacques de la Rosière. And you know what our fee was? $5,000 a year. $5,000. What they didn't even call it a fee; they called it an honorarium. I have no commercial interest in China whatsoever. None. So I had, and you know what I used to do before I'd go to a China Development Bank meeting? I'd visit Glenn Stevens. And I'd say to the governor of our central bank, Glenn, what would you like me to inject into the conversation up there this week? Every year I would see him, and when I got the Chinese papers back, I would give them to the Reserve Bank. In other words, I sat as an Australian representative, essentially with Kissinger as my deputy for these years, sitting there, picking up intelligence out of the PRC, hoping I was doing a great thing for Australia and taking it back to the central bank here. That's what I was doing. But I've had to put up with this stuff out of Sky News, you know, that Dill Bolt and others, and of course, you know, I'll acid drop himself, Archer, saying, oh yes, but look, Keating's views are compromised, as if an Australian Prime Minister would compromise his commitment to the country because he sat on some international board and getting paid $5,000 a year and having no other interest there.
Having said all of that, and not in any way suggesting it's about commercial interests, but have you been surprised by the way the Chinese have developed their military in the last 5 years? You know, it's been an exponential growth in their spend.
Yeah, but their percent of their spending, defence spending to GDP is only a third of that, or 40% of that of the United States. As long as you understand that, right? They are bigger, so 40% of bigger is more, but it's nothing like the United States. The United States spends more than the next 10 countries behind it.
But why are they doing it?
Why are they? Well, they're doing it because, A, they have a huge economy which is internationally dependent, and because more latterly they have this sort of pressure from the US. And so, like every state of its government, remember the IMF says on a purchasing power parity basis, China is 20% larger than the US. So what do they want them to do? Have little toy destroyers in the bath. You know, they could, like little boy in the bath, they could muck around little boats in the bath. Would that suit the Americans? You know?
But you have said, nonetheless, that China doesn't have any territorial ambitions.
It doesn't, no.
So why do you need such a big land army, such a big navy?
Well, the land army of China is really part of the police force of the place, really. It's like a paramilitary type, the same as Indonesia, you know. Look, the Chinese are locked into a bowl. They've got Siberia to the north, they've got the Himalayas to the west, they have Indochina to the south. They don't go anywhere. They're not attacking anyone. All they've done is they've militarised those shoals in their South China Sea, but that's all about, as the American Defence Department says, restricting the United States from having a presence in China's periphery. In other words, until this happened, the US 7th Fleet used to patrol up along the territorial sea of China, 6 miles off the coast. You know, the Chinese said, bugger this, we're not having this anymore. You know, we don't want to be rude, but we don't have to put up with this anymore, you know.
If I could just ask one question before we turn to our my colleagues in Canberra, which isn't directly related to AUKUS, but it does go back to some comments you made in 2021 and is relevant to the Ukraine situation. What's your view of China's ambitions to the west in the Stans, given the incredibly rich payload of...
well, I told you this on our last program, last time we met here. China's interests are not in the east. See, Australia and the US think, oh, the Chinese, they're going to muck around with the Philippines. All their interests are in the east. No. What's their interest in the east is to keep the front door mat clean, not have the US 7th Fleet up there. Their real interests are in the west. The west of China and in the stand countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, these countries, which I believe they'll have major influence in all the way up to Istanbul. You know, you can say, so China, see, this is the point. Developed countries like Australia are about 90% urbanised. China, that's Germany, France, US. China is 55. It's got another 35 to go. And it's got the stand countries. So China's growth is just going to keep on coming, you know. And as you know, they've got an agreement to take railways and roads up to Gdansk in Poland. So here's the Americans. I mean, they've always been protected by the two oceans. But now, for the Americans, the Pacific and the Atlantic are a corset. They're a corset on them. They've got nowhere to go. They're protected, but they've got nowhere to go. But the Chinese have got lots of places to go. You know?
Well, we'll switch to the press club in Canberra and my colleagues
I better
there.
put something in my ear.
Yes, we've got some questions. And while we're just sorting out Mr. Keating's earpiece, the first question today will be from Phil Curry from the Financial Review.
Thanks, Laura. I hope you can hear me, Mr. Keating. Look, Richard Marles, perhaps in anticipation of your comments today, in defending yesterday's announcement, said, "We have witnessed in our region the single biggest conventional military build-up anywhere in the world since the end of the Second World War." He says to not respond to that is to be condemned by history. Could I just ask you to clarify, do you think we should not respond to it at all, or we're responding in the wrong way?
We're responding in the wrong way. The Collins-class boat, which I built with Kim Beazley, was a boat designed in the defence of Australia. It was designed to present the continental shelf, the continental lands of Australia, and to repel any invasion of us. What these boats are, and this is what I don't think the Defence Minister is telling you, is that these boats are designed to sit off the continental shelf of China and sink American nuclear-capable, weapons-capable submarines. Now, I'll just make this point to you. China's peripheral waters, let's make this point that people may not know. About 100 miles off the Chinese coast, there's a plateau. It's a very shallow plateau, right? Very shallow plateau. Any American nuclear-armed sub's got to get across that plateau before they get to the deep water. So the Americans said, we can have, like ducks in a shooting gallery, we will shoot them out before they can get to the deep water. But in the Chinese shallow water, the Chinese have it absolutely loaded with sensors and with equipment to detect large submarines. An 8,000-tonne submarine is going to be visible in a second with the Chinese coming across it. So our submarines are going to be susceptible. Our submarines are going to be in the peripheral waters of China, where the platforms and sensors are most concentrated, right? So while the Americans think they can shoot Chinese submarines like ducks in a barrel, the Chinese can also shoot our submarines because we're in the shallow water and we are detectable, right? So this is a strange way to be defending Australia, to have your submarines sunk on the Chinese continental shelf, chasing Chinese submarines, where in fact with the Collins model, you had, and if the numbers are right, 45 or 50 conventional submarines around the coast of Australia saying, put a step over our finger, we'll punch your lights out. That's the better defence policy for Australia than joining with the Americans up there in the shallow waters of the Chinese coast trying to knock out. See, look, you know this, Phil, you may know this. The Chinese in the air-sea battle plan they had 8 or 10 years ago was whether they could knock out all the Chinese nuclear weapons in one strike. And people doubt that this can happen. You know, you can find the sites and knock them out. All states. So what big states do is they have submarines in deep water that carry the same nuclear weapons that are not subject to a strike. It's called the second strike capability. What the Americans are trying to do is deny the Chinese a second strike capability. and we'd be the mugs up there helping them. We'd be up there saying, oh no, we'll put our boats into jeopardy in the shallow waters of China. Instead of, what is our aim in life? It is to protect the continent of Australia. Border with no one, shallow waters. We don't need 8,000-tonne submarines. Collins was 4. We could have 50 Collins-class boats and 15 at sea, and we'd have a much stronger defence than this rubbish that the government's doing.
So you might like to adjust your earpiece again, Mr Keating, while we get ready for the next question, which is from Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times.
Thank you, Mr Keating. I want to draw you towards Indonesia, a place I lived for 2 years. You visited many times as Prime Minister. In 1995, you signed the landmark security deal with Indonesia, and a year later in Singapore, you talked of the great uncertainty with China. On Indonesia, could you talk to the impact the AUKUS agreement will have on the Australia-Indonesia relationship?
Well, look, I've said before many times, Australia's strategic bread is buttered in the Indonesian archipelago. A major attack on them, and the only people that could attack them majorly would be the Chinese, would affect us, whether we liked it or not. And a major attack on us would affect them. So this is why I put the agreement together with Suharto. An attack on any one of us was an attack on all of us. So what wise governments do is they put safety things in place. You know, you don't sit there waiting for someone to hit you over the head to think, hang on, I better put a few defences up here. So Indonesia is central to our security, our long-term security, and not that I expect, let me repeat, I don't expect any Chinese military assaults upon the Indonesian archipelago or us, but nevertheless a prudent country running a defence policy, which is what I've done in the years I was in office, would be to see to have that archipelago at least, you know, capable of not intrusion by, let's call it, a negative power. Now, but you see, what the difference is, what Anthony Albanese has done this week, he screwed into place the last shackle in the long chain which the Americans have laid out to contain China. We are now part of a containment policy against China. You know, we've got Japan, the US, ourselves, and India, right? And buying these subs was like Anthony Albanese screwing up the shackle to make sure all the chains are connected. That's what we're doing. Instead of doing a more sensible thing, say, look, our bread is buttered in Southeast Asia. It's Southeast Asia that matters. It's Indonesia which matters. Let's get along. I mean, the Chinese don't want to attack anybody. They don't want to attack us, and they don't want to attack the Americans, and they don't want to attack the Indonesians. So what is all this? It's only about one matter only: the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in East Asia. This is what this is all about. You know, and I go back to the point I made to Laura. If the US has no continental land in East Asia, how does it suspect or argue that it can remain the strategic superpower? Because if it all turns badly, it'll be just like Afghanistan and Iraq. The Americans will pull out and leave the mess behind. They would just go back to San Diego, 10,000 kilometres, and leave us with the consequences. You know, that would be the outcome.
Andrew Probyn from the ABC has a question.
Mr Keating, you said before that that China has not threatened Australia, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that they have issued sanctions on coal, timber, wine, lobster, barley, Australian products, that there has been a debt diplomacy employed among our Pacific neighbours, an encroachment of the South China Sea, an effective annexation of some islands, a huge military ramp-up that Laura's asked you about. How is this not, as one Biden official said this week, undeclared economic and commercial boycott of Australia?
The threat to Australia is a military threat, right? A military threat. It's a threat for the for the army of the People's Republic of China to come and occupy Australia. That's what a threat is. Like, for instance, a similar threat would be if someone went to occupy Tasmania on us, right? That's what a threat is. Commercial reactions on things like the things you mentioned, they're not strategic. They're not in a threat. You know, I mean, look at what we're doing to them in the WTO and all the steel dumping and all the rest of our stuff. You know, I mean, you know, in the friction of international politics, these things turn up, but they're not threats. You can't impute threat meaning invasion with putting a tariff on wine. Or maybe you're silly enough to think that. You know, do you think you are silly enough to think that?
Mr. Keating, cyber attack.
Well, what do you think? The Americans and the Russians are not into cyber attacks? Who in the world is not into cyber attacks? Or do you think we are not? You know, just remember this. The best friend we had in Asia was a former president of Indonesia, Batu, Yudhoyono, you know. He was the best guy we had barracking for us, you know. Those dopes in AUKUS tapped his telephone and that of his wife. Tapped his phone. I mean, this is what states get up to if you let these security agencies, ning-nongs, take control, you know. But you can't impute, as your question imputes, that a tax or a tariff on wine or barley is equivalent to an invasion of the country. China does not threaten Australia, has not threatened Australia, does not intend to threaten Australia. You can have all these commercial rows you like, we can have diplomatic sort of dust. Remember, this all happened after Maurice Payne, you know, the great non-minister of our time, went on the Insiders program and said we're going to have weapons-type inspections of Wuhan to find out what was the cause of the virus. It was out of that came all of this, you know. So you can't put a question without contexting it, like, you know. I mean, contextualisation may not be your long suit, but that's what you should be doing.
Olivia Caisley from Sky News.
Olivia Caisley from Sky News. You've described Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defence Minister Richard Marles as seriously unwise in this 9-page document. Unlike present players, you haven't received a military briefing on this issue since the mid-90s. Could you be out of touch on this issue? And given you didn't foresee the military build-up from China as well as intimidation of neighbouring countries when you were in office, what makes you so sure China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, you know, and I read every day, you know. I mean, why would China want to threaten? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? I mean, could they ever bring the numbers here? It would be an armada of troop ships to do it, you know. So you don't need a briefing from the dopey security agencies we have in Canberra to tell you that, you know. I mean, I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer.
Well, so do you just let them carry on with their business, whether that be in the Spratly Islands or wherever, you just say, oh, well, they don't plan to attack Australia, so it's all okay?
You know how big what's the other islands we're always talking about? Just look, just pick it up, just go on to Google Maps and have a look at it. It's about as big as Centennial Park, about as large as Centennial Park in Sydney. That's what we're talking about here. You know, I mean, you know, Sky News, you got to dust up your reputation to be on Sky News, you know, and you're probably doing your best to do that.
Thank you.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Keating. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. I just wanted to ask, you've talked a lot about orthodox threats, that being an invasion of Australia, but you know, as my colleagues have said up here, there are many other different types of threats, and particularly for Australia, we're a trading nation. All of our wealth comes in a large part from overseas trade, and that's, you know, similarly to the US interest in Asia. A lot of their trade comes from Asia as well. Shouldn't Australia, you know, work with a partner like the US to protect trade, which is its main economic interest in the region?
This is the United States that would never, ever agree at congressional level to ratify the international program on the law of the sea. You realise that, don't you? The US refused to ratify the law of the sea program, right? So that puts a pretty big hole through that question, doesn't it? Secondly, why would the Chinese can't find an alternative supply to Australian iron ore? They've got 30% of their country still to build. We have the highest grade, 63% Fe iron ore, 10 steaming days from their coast. What, do you think they don't want that? You think we need the American military at the Pentagon to make sure our iron ore boats go to China? The Chinese, it's a wonder they don't have a welcome for us out every day one of these damn things turns up, because all that tonnage on their wharves build these Chinese cities. The story of modern China is a story of urbanisation. That's what it is. Urban areas are built with steel. Steel can only be done in China out of Australia. So why would the Chinese want to interrupt their capacity to deal with us? You know, why would we see some donkey in Washington to help us? You know?
Jess Malcolm from The Australian.
Thanks, Mr. Keating. I'd like to ask you about the government's proposed changes to super tax concessions and whether you have a position on that.
I'm not doing, this is all about AUKUS. I'm not doing super today. I mean, I've done super since I was a kid.
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
I do have a backup question. I do have a question on China. China's submarine fleet is forecast to grow by 6 nuclear-powered submarines by 2030, and they're building 20 service warships a year, which is even more than the entire Australian fleet. In your opinion, who is being more provocative, Australia or China?
It's not, what the Chinese do in the building of fleet is not provocation. Why do you use the word provocation? That's the wrong word to be using. You know, they're a major state. They have an economy bigger than the United States. They spend about 40% of their national budget on defence. The Americans spend more than the next 9 states in the world on defence. So why is it a provocation? Why would you think it's a provocation for a great state like China to build a navy? Why would you think that? I mean, I just don't accept it. You know, the question's invalid. That's the truth of it, you know.
Thank you.
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age has a question.
Hi, Mr. Keating. I'll ask 2 parts if I could. You've been extremely critical today of the Albanese government, including Ministers Richard Marles and Penny Wong. Are you concerned that your comments today could represent a fundamental rupture with the party? You've already said that the Prime Minister hasn't responded to your request to brief him on this. And secondly, you have a tremendous skill for invective and criticism. Could I ask you now to turn some of that to the Chinese Communist Party and its treatment of Uyghurs, for example, its treatment of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong? Will you be similarly critical of them as you are of people in your own party and journalists?
After what you co-wrote with Hartcher last week in that shocking presentation in the Herald on Monday, Tuesday, and when you should hang your head in shame, I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You know, you ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism, you know. I mean, that's the most egregious, the worst, the most biased presentation. You pick up 4 specialists. You could have picked up John McCarthy, a long-term specialist, Alan Gingell. You pick up 4 China hawks, the biggest of them all, Jennings, you know, Davina Lee. These are all China hawks. You represent them to your community as having an independent view, where you know full well that you've selected them to do this thing. And here you are asking me about Uyghurs, and you're asking me about, if I said to you, and I did say when I saw her last time, here's the Prime Minister over, there's everyone over to India, not one question from any one of you about Modi shutting in the Muslims in Kashmir, in the pro-Hindu policies. Nothing.
But there is still a question, Mr. Keating, about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, well, look, the treatment of the Uyghurs, I'm not to defend China about the Uyghurs. I mean, there's disputes about what the nature of the Chinese affront to the Uyghurs are. There's a dispute about that. But one thing we can't be sure of, what if the Chinese said, but look, what about deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in your prison system? You know, wouldn't that be a valid point for them? Wouldn't it be a valid point? In other words, great power diplomacy cannot be about reaching down into the low social entrails of these states any more than they can with us. You know, but the Sydney Morning Herald, frankly, has lost. It's a newspaper without integrity, and the Age follows it in. Poor little, like a little pup running behind. You know, I mean, if I were you, mate, I'd hide my face and never appear again.
What we have just witnessed was a complete intellectual beatdown. This was not a press conference. It was a public reckoning for the entire Australian media industry. Facing a room of hostile and well-prepared journalists, Paul Keating showed the world what a takedown looks like. He used the most humiliating language like, "You should hang your head in shame," to attack the journalist's professional integrity. He used the simplest common sense like, "Because I've got a brain," to counter their profoundly stupid questions. He even used the U.S. Defense Department's own report to refute a group of cheerleaders who seemed even more enthusiastic than the Americans themselves. This confrontation is so important because it brutally exposed an ugly truth. Australia's media, which is supposed to be a watchdog of democracy, has, to a large extent, become a lapdog for American strategic interests. When an American citizen like Rupert Murdoch controls Australia's largest media empire, and when Wall Street's capital giants are major shareholders in another, then the collective, pathetic performance we saw today is not an accident. It's an inevitability. This stunning confrontation forces us to ask some very serious questions. When a nation's top journalists act more like agents for a foreign power on issues critical to national destiny, is that country's democracy still healthy? When the entire public discourse is dominated by a single pro-American narrative, so much so that a basic fact-based debate is no longer possible, can that country still make the right decisions for its own future? And when the ignorance and bias of the media are pushing the nation towards a potentially costly conflict, how much impact can a sane but lonely voice like Paul Keating's truly have? If you found this episode valuable, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.